Welcome to Under the Microscope. I am your host, Jenny Germano. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for today's episode. We are going to be discussing two markets, one plant, navigating the hemp and cannabis divide. And before I dive in, I just want to give a little bit about my background. I got my start in the cannabis industry in 2009 here in Denver, Colorado, running vertically integrated cannabis operations. And in 2015, I founded my company, ICS Consulting, and I've been helping operators navigate the regulatory landscape across the United States for the last 10 years. With that being said, let's everyone give a warm welcome to our next guest, Aaron Tucker. Aaron is an attorney and the founder of Shadow Mountain Law and Fire Business Strategies. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you, Jenny. So I guess I'll take the lead and share a little bit about my
Sure.
background as well. So I got started professionally in the cannabis industry somewhere around 2016, 2017, although the cannabis industry was very much humming in the background the entire time. I was in undergrad. I moved out here to Colorado right in 2012, right as the adult use market was coming online. So it was always there. And I'm a bit unique among attorneys, as I understand it, because I went to law school really specifically to work in this industry. I had gotten my certification in cannabis horticulture from Amsterdam and was really interested in how I could make an impact in this new industry. And after working with some friends in a cannabis startup, I really saw that the law was that best opportunity for me and my skill set. So right away in law school, I knew I was going to be a cannabis attorney. And all of my experiences really reflected that. I helped work with one of the first companies to release CBD products in the EU. This was before the 2018 Farm Bill came into play here in the US. I worked with Vicente as a law clerk. I worked with a number of small firms as well, all on cannabis regulatory and business issues. After graduating law school, I went and worked in house at Truly, where I helped to lead their new state expansion and licensing efforts. And after spending some time there, I went and started my own two companies, Shadow Mountain Business Law, which focuses on providing standard sort of regulatory and business and particularly transactional advice in the cannabis, hemp, and psychedelics industries. I also have Fire Business Strategies, which is a consulting firm really focused on doing market research and data analytics, looking at patterns of use in the cannabis industry, how those are evolving, doing market research for folks, and as well as developing business intelligence and other sort of quantitative tools for businesses to use in tandem with some of that market research. So that's a bit about me and my background.
That is very unique. You have a lot of good experience. I appreciate you coming on. I think this is going to be really helpful for our listeners. And so, with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. And we're going to basically start. And the first area is the regulatory and legal divide. And so, my question for you is when someone says hemp versus cannabis, what is the first thing that you want people to really understand here?
Yeah, I think the number one thing to understand about hemp versus cannabis, and it really sets up this whole divide that's currently happening, is that fundamentally what we mean when we say hemp is we're talking about a legal distinction. It's an artificial legal construct that was created by the 2018 Farm Bill and the state laws that have responded to that. It's not a botanical distinction. When we're talking about the cannabis plant, we're really talking about one plant, right? Hemp and cannabis plants can interbreed. They are fundamentally the same plant. And in fact, a plant can be hemp at one stage in its life cycle and cannabis at a different stage in its life cycle, which really means that these two different products are totally indistinguishable without advanced laboratory testing equipment. So, just to paraphrase this legal distinction a little bit, right, from the Farm Bill, hemp is the plant Cannabis sativa L, which is the same thing as our recreational marijuana plant. And any part or derivative of the plant, as well as the products that are derived from those parts or derivatives that have less than 0.3% THC on a dry weight basis. Farm Bill compliant hemp and products that are made from hemp are exempt from the Federal Controlled Substances Act. That's why this distinction becomes so important. But it is fundamentally an arbitrary distinction, a line in the sand that's been drawn 0.3% or less in your hemp, greater than 0.3% in your illegal marijuana. But because of this legal distinction, the operators on one side of the line, the hemp side of the line versus the marijuana side of the line, are in virtually opposite regulatory frameworks. They have to take a virtually opposite mindset when they approach this, even though they're growing the same plant, they're producing many of the same products. And that's because the hemp folks are dealing with a situation where their activities are federally legal. Their activities are heavily restricted by state laws. Many states have, since the 2018 Farm Bill, come in and they've either regulated hemp or they've outright banned hemp products or they've done something in between. So they know what they're doing is generally, as a federal matter, lawful, but figuring out how to thread that needle and comply with the state laws in all the states where they operate and sell their product in interstate commerce is the challenge they face. On the other hand, in cannabis, it's federally prohibited. There is no federal law really that governs these cannabis activities. Now, of course, you'll have to follow federal standards around worker safety, all kinds of things. There are opportunities for federal liability, to be clear, but as a fundamental matter, everything you're doing is illegal, right? You can try to comply with federal standards, but as a baseline matter, it's illegal under federal law. And what they're really looking at is a very heavy set of state regulations that they need to comply with exactly because, frankly, the state compliance piece is a huge component of this grace that's been extended to the states by the federal government, not sending the DEA in to raid cannabis shops. It's a very rare occurrence. And part of the reason it's a rare occurrence is because states mean business when they write regulations and they enforce them. And that has somewhat empowered the federal government to remain hands off. So that's the fundamental thing
Yeah.
people should take away is that these are the same plant. It's a legal distinction. And that legal distinction drives some realities, but it is fundamentally the same plant, the same product, and much the same market.
Yeah, that was really clear. And thanks for explaining that. For those who maybe are confused, because I can understand how this can be very confusing for people. Can you highlight kind of some of the lesser known regulatory issues? For example, like testing, total THC definitions, and diversion risk that clients that you advise frequently that they run into?
Yeah, so I'll start with something that I think helps clarify that distinction between cannabis and hemp that is an issue that's very common. And fundamentally, that's the question of is this post decarboxylation THC when we say 0.3% THC, or is it pre decarboxylation? So, for those not in the know, the plant naturally creates a compound known as THCA. THCA itself is not necessarily psychoactive in quite the same way that THC is. It has
Okay.
to become THC in order to become psychoactive. What's the main way you make a THC? You light it on fire. You can also expose it to light.
Yeah.
You can expose it to any number of things. When that happens, the A in THCA disappears. It makes up about 12% of the mass of that molecule, and you're left with THC. So the federal definition is 0.3% THC. You can have an unlimited amount of THCA and be in line with that federal definition. But many states take a definition that is total THC. So they say that, it's that THC plus 87% approximately of the THCA in your product. Now, in that case, a lot of these THCA products have become unlawful in that state. Even in states that don't have a total THC test, you can have situations where law enforcement use equipment that results in a post decarboxylation reading of the THC content. And so you have a law enforcement stop, they stop a shipment of hemp, they take it, they pull it, they test it, and it appears that it tests much higher THC. This is a THCA product. Their testing method decarboxylated it, and now they appear to have So that's a really sticky, thorny issue. And when I
Yeah.
say cannabis can be hemp at one stage in its life cycle and marijuana at a different stage, that's what I mean. Early in the flowering process, it's virtually all THCA. It's only as things progress generally that you start to see elevated quantities of THC. And the listeners can test this for themselves if they don't already know this, if they're not operators. Go look at your compliance label for your latest order. What you may find is that there's virtually no THC in your product that you bought from the dispensary. It's all THCA. And that's what many of these hemp products are and how they are being sold under this federal regime. So that's a big one.
Hmm.
The second one that I'll point out is these are two fundamentally different legal regimes, right? Under the federally lawful hemp regime, unless it is strongly state regulated, there are not necessarily particularly strong federal standards around how these products are tested. And so states that have lawful cannabis programs may be the kind of state that encourages you to go out there, buy hemp biomass, convert it, put it into a THC product and sell it. That can happen. But many states are actually very concerned because they want the products that are being sold in that marijuana market or that state licensed cannabis market to be one to one with or grown and cultivated in that market. Right. So that's what's called the inversion problem. And states like Colorado are having real issues with that, trying to prevent operators from going out and buying hemp, which is comparatively very cheap, and bringing it into that regulated state market. On the other side is the maybe more obvious diversion problem, right? Nobody wants a state cannabis license holder to be selling that through the mail, right? That's clearly
Yeah.
unlawful and just calling it hemp. And that's the diversion problem that states are dealing with more broadly, right? So there are different approaches to inversion. Every state is concerned with diversion, concerned with that regulated marijuana product ending up in interstate commerce being sold as hemp. The other thing I'll just round out and say, as many of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with all of hemp and cannabis business, these regulatory issues and many more creep into even ordinary business issues, right? Compliance
Yeah.
with corporate formalities becomes even more important when the state is concerned about, okay, which company sold this hemp versus which company sold this marijuana in our regulated market. Managing relationships with your vendors and suppliers is huge when you have these sort of nebulous issues of total THC and are the lab tests that you're receiving real, right? There's a lot of trust and relationship management that has to go into operating on either side of the line, especially when you're operating on both sides of the line.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And the diversion and the inversion is something that's definitely people would thought, oh, with the regulated systems in place, we're not going to have inversion and diversion, but we are. And it's not just Colorado. Obviously, it's happening across the United States, like Oklahoma. I've seen it, in reports coming out of Michigan. So it's very interesting what's going on. And do you think things like diversion and inversion, are they gonna get a handle on that, or is that just gonna be a natural occurrence because we're dealing with a federally illegal, or if it was not even illegal on a federal level, this is just something we would naturally always see?
Yeah, I think I'll take them in turn. On the diversion front, I mean, with both of these, the commonality fundamentally is it's difficult to control for operators that aren't going to follow the law, for bad actors, right? So, in terms of the
Yeah.
folks that are following the law, following the regulations, I think by and large, there are fairly good systems in place to manage diversion and inversion, right? Obviously, diversion is a criminal offense, right? That's that, right? There's almost no higher deterrent that is possible. And on the inversion front, you have seed to sale tracking systems. Now, can there be fraud? Can there be any number of issues on that front? Yeah, absolutely. And those are real challenges. But those to me are challenges that are more human nature than regulatory in nature. So I believe that states have gotten almost as good of a handle on it as they can, controlling for human nature kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, I will say that in the inversion context, they're really fighting an uphill battle fundamentally. Like it just makes good business sense if you can and it's lawful to obtain cannabinoids from the hemp market. Right? They're generally cheaper. Everyone in this industry is getting squeezed on markets. If you can and it's lawful, it makes good business sense. And so the incentives are really difficult for any regulator that's going to try to shut that down to grapple with. What I would prefer to see, just as putting my policy hat on, would be really equivalency in those testing standards. You can invert
Yeah.
if it meets all of these standards, right? Then, you know, the incentives can play out the way they're going to play out, but the state can protect their interests, protects their consumers.
Yeah, and I think too at the end of the day, the human nature for those who don't want to play by the rules, they're always going to be looking for loopholes to expose. I think that's just natural no matter what industry you're in, what regulated industry you're in. If there's people want to find a way to get around the rules and regulations in all kinds of industries. And so I think that's just normal. So yeah, that was really helpful. Thanks for talking about that. And the next piece I want to tackle is the state of the consumer market. And what does the consumer market look like for hemp products versus licensed cannabis products right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to begin with the caveat, right? I don't want to be like a full Pollyanna and say everything's the best that it ever could be, right? Things could certainly be better from an access
Sure.
perspective, from a quality perspective, right? There are lots of legitimate concerns out there with lab fraud, with all kinds of issues. We still don't have 50 states legal weed sent straight to your mail. These are things that could be better, but it is a very good time to be a cannabis consumer in this country. It's probably never been better. The consumer market for cannabis is extraordinarily strong. We're seeing from a combination of state legalization efforts and the Farm Bill's creation, this vast normalization of cannabis consumption, this vast increase in access to cannabis. We did see there was a period of time in the COVID era when, if you look at the consumer numbers, you had a huge contingent of people become every single day smokers. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's worn off a little bit to an extent when we look at our consumer numbers. But that next level down, that 5 times a week kind of consumer, extraordinarily strong, never been better. And so it's a very good time because it's normalized in many places. It's fairly highly regulated, whether you're buying hemp or whether you're buying state regulated cannabis. Really strong numbers for users, strong numbers pattern of consumption. And as far as the two different markets, they're really not that different when you look at them in the aggregate, when you look at the nation as a whole, right? Which is a fairly similar product selection. You see everything from flowers to vapes to gummies, similar in terms of sell through and those sort of product selection categories. You see fairly similar prices, honestly, which is a big thing that draws people to hemp, right? Because their margins are better if their prices are the same, their costs are lower, right? But fairly similar prices in the cannabis market, the state licensed marijuana market. The real differences are you're going into a licensed store. Now, increasingly, states are rolling out licensing regimes for retailers of hemp, but it's not necessarily the norm like it is for the cannabis market, right? You're going into a licensed, dedicated, we sell cannabis sort of store. Your delivery options are generally highly limited, right? I don't live in Denver. I'll probably never get delivery anything, or even in other states, you're looking at fairly limited delivery options. You are looking at a situation where many consumers, at least if they're informed consumers, have a high degree of confidence, right? They have a high degree of confidence this product is well regulated. They have a high degree of confidence it's safe. I don't necessarily get texts from my friends being like, "Hey, is this dispensary okay to go to?" But I get plenty of texts from friends and family asking, "Hey, is this brand of hemp product safe?" So there is a
So
general
true.
perception of greater
Yeah.
safety in the licensed cannabis market. In the hemp market, delivery is the norm. Getting it delivered straight to your door is the norm through the mail. That's how it works. Yes, like I said, folks are trying to roll out things to shut that down. Minnesota has some recent efforts to shut that down. Lots and lots of states do. That's by no means exclusive. And states are increasingly looking to regulate it like cannabis and alcohol. But fundamentally, right now, it's regulated like a food product in many states that have not taken the active measures to regulate it as such. So it needs to be safe for roll up, needs to be safe. but it doesn't necessarily have extreme cannabis compliance. But again, this is different. Every state is doing a different experiment with this at this point. Back in 2018, when the Farm Bill first passed, 2019, 2020, it was very Wild Westy, but at this point, we're dealing with lots and lots of different systems. So it's hard to generalize. But those are the broad parameters. You have the norm being a licensed store versus the norm being delivered to your door. And with that comes the trade off of consumer confidence.
What I find really interesting about the hemp market and is that you can have a very well branded packaging that you would find when you walked into Vitamin Cottage or Whole Foods or your local grocery store chain, all these places that are selling hemp products. And then that's like at a gas station, right? And someone says, oh, the packaging looks attractive. It's really nice. Or even maybe it's not even being sold on a gas station, it's online. And you have a very well branded and designed website, and
Mhm.
then people are purchasing these products, and maybe that product's not tested. You don't know how safe it is, or there's not a lot of information, or the consumers aren't educated on. I need to look at the testing results and to see how it's tested. And even then, are they fabricated testing results? Like, how do you even verify? Because there's not a state licensed lab like on the marijuana side. I would think it would be challenging for consumers. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything about the packaging and how appealing that can be and how it's hard for a consumer to discern.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely reiterate it as it's a challenging market for a consumer. And
Yeah.
I would say fundamentally, the good actors in both industries are behaving radically similar. But in
Mm.
industry, as you indicated, with this patchwork of different state programs, with these differences and even level of compliance with said programs, right? There maybe is more opportunity or maybe less of an enforcement mechanism than we see in the state cannabis industry. In the state, the MED is out there issuing violations all the time. And don't get me wrong, right? There are states that are issuing violations all the time for hemp, but maybe you don't live in one of those states. And so
Yeah.
you're in a difficult situation.
Yeah, and just for listeners, the MED being the Marijuana Enforcement Division in Colorado, which regulates marijuana here. So, from your perspective, are the consumers perceiving hemp and cannabis as distinct, or is the boundary being blurred? What signals are you seeing right now?
So in my data sets that I look at from a consumer market perspective, there definitely is a gap here. It's hard to say concretely for sure. But what I will say is that the boundary is an arbitrary legal distinction. As I've said before, right? You can get many of the same products in the same places. And so generally, consumers see them as interchangeable. People want cannabis. People love
Yeah.
consuming cannabis in this country. Like I said, it's never been better. There are enormous numbers of people consuming cannabis in every state in the country, including states like Texas, where they only have like maybe 100,000 legal patients. They have
Yeah.
something like 4 million cannabis consumers in Texas at this point. People love consuming cannabis and they will get it however they can. There are a certain portion of consumers that might choose hemp for various reasons, whether that's price, whether that's convenience. But by and large, people are just going to get cannabis however they can get it. If they're in a state where they don't have access to it in a legal store, then they're definitely going to buy hemp, or they're going to go to the black market, or they're going to do something to get cannabis. If they're in a state that does have legal stores, it's an open question how many of them are actually defecting to the hemp market versus just preferring the cannabis market when it is a choice. Because they're in states like Colorado, our hemp market has largely been decimated by regulatory action to really clamp down on the amount of products that are available and to really funnel people to the stores. But there are states where they coexist, and it's really not clear how much that's actually affecting the licensed stores. It's not clear that the consumers really are one and the same, even though they view them as interchangeable. Clear that when states clamp down, like Colorado did, that it helps cannabis operators necessarily. Again, it's an open question there to what extent there's a switching that occurs when consumers are given equal choice. But by and large, they view them as one and the same, and they're going to get cannabis
Yeah.
however they can.
Yeah, I think that's really true. For this next section, I'm actually excited about this. I find this a very interesting, which is crossover strategies and cannabis to hemp and then hemp to cannabis, the crossover. So where do you see the market opportunity in each and where are the biggest risks?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to be clear. There's market opportunity on both sides of this divide for sure. And many savvy operators are operating on both sides of the divide in various capacities, whether it is having a hemp brand that licenses their brand to the cannabis industry and makes money somehow from that, or it's the other way around. There are many operators that are finding ways to operate on both sides. Many MSOs are moving into this. The opportunity, though, is also fundamentally the risk, right? Whatever the opportunity is, whether it's the opportunity that you see in cannabis to access those consumers or the opportunity in hemp, that's where the risk comes from, right? So in hemp, just to illustrate, in hemp, you have this nationwide distribution opportunity. You have the opportunity to engage in like real brand building. And we're talking about the way that like CPGs do, anything else that's sold in the gas station, Monster Energy, whatever you want. You have the opportunity to do some real nationwide brand building. You have the opportunity to distribute through lots of different channels. Depending on the state, you might be able to sell it in a gas station. You might be able to sell it in a liquor store. You might be able to sell it in a dispensary. You might be able to sell it in all three places, again, depending on the state. So you've got this wide distribution network, lots of different opportunities. With all of that different opportunity comes different compliance risks, right? You've now exposed
Yeah.
yourself to compliance risk in 50 states. You've exposed yourself to the compliance risk when you sell at a dispensary. You've exposed yourself to the compliance risk in a liquor store. You're going to have to interact with lots and lots of industries, all of which have their own compliance risk. You're shipping things through the mail. Oh my goodness. Now you need to know the policies and procedures of FedEx and UPS and know which of
Oh
those
my
is right for your
gosh.
business. It becomes very dizzying very fast because there's so much opportunity. On the other side, the opportunity in cannabis is that the reach of hemp isn't what it once was. We are seeing this state by state whack a mole, right? In 2018, it was almost this no man's land as states have come to realize that these products were federally legalized, whether intended or not. They're trying to do something about it. And so you're seeing this fragmented sort of patchwork, and the circle is gradually closing in if you're a hemp business. And so you might see the opportunity, okay, if I want to preserve my nationwide dispensing network, whatever that is, in some states, I'm going to have to partner with dispensaries or I'm going to have to partner with manufacturers. There's also a perception by many, and if you go on LinkedIn, you'll see it all the time, that the hemp
Yeah.
industry is fundamentally a loophole. And that loophole is one day going to close. Right. And so, as a smart business person, maybe it's a loophole, maybe it's not, but maybe I want to hedge my risk. I know I want to have a cannabis business that comes out on top, whatever that looks like. Maybe the vision of federal legalization was achieved with the Farm Bill. We have direct to your door cannabis deliveries. Imagine that. And maybe that continues to expand and we get 50 states again. And that's the way that your business is going to win. That's the direction that the market goes. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe that whole loophole collapses, and then you need to make sure you're in cannabis, right? So there's a sort of hedging your bets against regulatory risk that really comes into play here, where operators are, they don't know what's going to happen. Nobody really does,
Mm.
whether it's with federal marijuana legalization through that pathway, whether we already have federal marijuana legalization through the Farm Bill, they don't know. And so they're trying to make sure that they're well positioned to take advantage of whatever opportunities come their way.
The reason I like this topic is because I'm watching it happen with my own eyes. I have people that contact me and said, "Hey, I had a CBD brand. I actually want to open a dispensary now. I don't want to do CBD anymore." Or people who were on the marijuana side said, "Hey, we want to leave and we want to start a CBD brand." Or they're doing both, where they're in the regulated marijuana side and now they decided to make a hemp brand. What I also think the challenge, the hurdle, the 50 states, and if people are buying online, you're all 50 states, you have to keep up with who's banning hemp, right? There's all the different types. We have CBD, we have the intoxicating hemp, just all these different
Mhm.
things that you're having to manage and who's banning what and what's regulated. And some of it has to go through the regulated system, like when you're in like Michigan, for example, you have to go through the CRA and you just can't go off and do it by yourself. And I know in Colorado, we have some strict regulations around intoxicating hemp, and every state is different. And so you really do have to understand what you're navigating. And there's a big responsibility to it and actually cost. There's a cost to keeping up with that compliance because if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to have to hire an attorney or somebody in the compliance or that area or an expert that can manage all 50 states and keep up with all the different moving pieces and rules and regulations. That's just a lot, I think, for
Yeah,
just a small business to try to keep up with.
it's a really big challenge. On the flip side, when we look at the marijuana industry and they're maybe doing a better job with this, it's not really clear, but they're trying to do a better job. The barriers to entry are massive, right? It is just possible for inexperienced or even maybe an experienced entrepreneur from outside this space to break into that space. But the hemp space, that barrier to entry, yeah, the compliance risk is huge. Yeah, absolutely. You can catch an unlimited number of fines selling hemp across the country if you want to.
Yeah.
But that barrier, that initial barrier to entry, much lower. And maybe you build yourself a brand that consumers recognize. And now that you got that, now you're presenting that to an investor. Oh my gosh, that's money. You don't have that opportunity in
Yeah.
marijuana necessarily to build up a brand and then be like, okay, now give me money so I can open a dispensary.
Yeah. And I think too on the marijuana side, it is a challenge. And unless the state that you're operating in offers like social equity or micro business licensing, which does lower the barrier, but also lowers the footprint. And it can also be constricting because in some states, sometimes you can only do micro to micro and you're not guaranteed to get on the shelf. It's hard to expand your footprint. You have less resources and then you're competing against all the commercial operators who can grow more, who have more access to capital than you do. It can be a challenge for a small business that doesn't have a lot of capital out of the gate to try to open a licensed marijuana business. And some really good points. I want to jump into kind of the practical guidance for operators and kind of the future outlook. So, for our listeners, like cultivators, facility builders, and license seekers, what are some strategies that they can think about if they are thinking about operating across both hemp and cannabis or just crossing over in general?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just throw out a quick disclaimer here. I am a lawyer, but I'm definitely not your lawyer if you're listening to this
That's
podcast.
right.
Actually, maybe not, definitely not. Maybe my clients are listening, but you will need to become my client in order for me to be your lawyer. So this is not legal advice, just general
Yeah,
parameters, but definitely talk to a lawyer if you're thinking about doing any of this. The number
agreed.
one thing that I would hammer home is the importance of keeping separation between plant touching businesses, right? We've talked about the inversion and the diversion problem, and every single state is extremely concerned about diversion, extremely concerned about diversion. Many states are extremely concerned about inversion. You need to make sure that you are keeping isolation between those two activities. You don't want to have any allegations that those actions are happening because they can't happen, at least to the extent they're not lawful. Diversion's always unlawful, inversion sometimes not. So very important that you keep separation. And that separation could look like a separate corporate structure, but maybe better still, it looks like just finding a way to dip your hand in the pot of the other and make some money off of that market without actually being directly involved. So a lot of what I see is folks doing brand licensing deals, doing contract manufacturing sort of deals where they are never in possession of the product. They are not responsible for compliance when it comes to the distribution in that market. They're just a brand, for example, and they're lending their brand equity to you so that you can exploit it in the hemp market or the cannabis market, as it may be. So it's really important to keep maximum separation between these two activities to avoid raising red flags as far as diversion, inversion, things like that. Um, Another thing I'll just say is that it's really important to understand that conceptually we're talking about two different things, as I've said before. right? When you are a hemp company, as we've discussed, you really need to be on the ball about having a broad compliance program that covers all of your different operations, all of the different that you're operating in. When you're in a cannabis company, you need to be very narrow and laser focused on your specific market. So two different mindsets. Those would be my two biggest takeaways.
No, that's really helpful, especially like the piece about the broad compliance program versus on the marijuana side, how it is very narrow and focused from a legal and structural perspective. So, how should they set up their entities, supply chains, and compliance to avoid some of these pitfalls that we've been discussing today?
Yeah. So let's start with entities. Observing corporate formalities is huge, right? However, you decide to set up your entity structure, right? Lots of people like to segregate their entities by operations, categories of risk. There's a lot of different philosophies and approaches. Other people prefer a simpler, more straightforward corporate structure. Whatever you're doing, though, it's really important that you observe corporate formalities. And by that, I mean that, like, if you're a corporation, you need to have a board of directors. They need to be a real board of directors. They need to have meetings. Whenever you want to do something that the board of
Yes.
directors is supposed to do, you should have the board of directors meet or at least sign a consent or something like that. You need to document that these entities are operating independently of one another and in accordance with corporate formalities, or else you get the allegation that really this is just one corporation and the separation we worked so hard to create for you is gone. It's poof, it's gone. It's a fiction. Right. So, really making sure that you are operating each of these businesses as an individual business. If you're moving assets around, you're documenting that and you're consenting to that. If you're doing really anything, you're documenting and consenting to it. It's also really important that you vet the suppliers,
Yeah.
the contractors, stuff like that. Because as I said, oftentimes, if you're a cannabis business trying to make a buck off hemp, you're going to have a contractor that actually manages the hemp side of the business for you to separate you from that. Is that contractor a good contractor? Are they going to follow the law? Because it's one thing to have indemnities. It's one thing to have reps and warranties that say that they will follow the law. I often tell clients, you can beat the rap, you can't beat the ride. If something in law enforcement gets involved, that sucks. It doesn't matter if you get paid on the back end because you had contractual rights. So you want to be proactive and avoid those sort of things. And as I mentioned, you want to really take that. Both are really good compliance approaches. Both, it's so important to be strict about your compliance, but you really have to reverse your way of thinking, right? In a hemp market, you start from the perspective almost, we can do this. Where can't we? And what do we have to do in order to do the thing that we can do? From a marijuana perspective, it's very much you cannot do this unless you follow these very specific rules in this very specific state.
Yeah. About the supply chain. I'm a big fan of auditing the supply chain, whether you're on the marijuana or the hemp side of things. You want to make sure that who you're purchasing from, that you're getting clean product. Have you walked their facility? Have you walked the cultivation facility where you're buying your raw materials from? It doesn't matter what side you come from. I think everyone, that's a good best practice. If I'm going to be making a product that a consumer is going to be consuming or inhaling into their body, to make sure that those materials are vetted and clean. That's, I think, important piece to add for that compliance component. In the next 2 to 3 years, how do you see the hemp cannabis divide evolving? Will we see further convergence, regulatory harmonization, or more of this fragmentation?
So I think I can talk about what I hope will happen and what I think will actually happen. And maybe let's start with kind of the more realistic brass tacks here. What's realistically most likely to continue to happen is we continue to see this state game of whack a mole, right? Federal 2018 Farm Bill, you have an almost wide open sort of hemp market, FDA and DEA opinions on it, notwithstanding that was the effect. Um, you then have states individually coming to realize that these products are out there, that people are buying them,
Yeah.
and that it is allegedly affecting cannabis operator profitability, although that I don't know if that's actually been carefully studied or is certain, but they're observing these things. And when they observe these things, they crack down. And when they crack down, the opportunity for hemp in that state diminishes depending on the crackdown, right? There are many states that have just said tested according to these standards. Things like the response, don't advertise to children, which nobody wants to be doing, at least nobody seriously. And that doesn't affect the good operators, but by and large, it can have the tendency to limit opportunity if it goes beyond those sort of things and into something like an outright ban on certain products. At the same time, the genie's out of the bottle. So we're going to
Yeah.
continue to see increasing use of cannabis, whether you call it cannabis or whether you call it hemp or whether you call it marijuana, wherever you buy it
Yeah.
from. We're going to continue to see increasing use. We're going to continue to see market normalization. We are going to continue to see some degree of harmonization, I believe, just because of the sharing of information, right? To the extent the marijuana regulators are siloed from the hemp regulators, there's going to be some communication and we might see some harmonization come from that. But fundamentally, what we're going to see is a game of state by state whack a mole as the opportunities decrease. Now, what I would really like to see is I would really like to see cannabis operators get behind this hemp movement. Maybe that ship has already sailed, but I would really like to see cannabis operators and hemp operators together saying, you know what, we are committed to being good operators. We're concerned about bad actors in our industry. We are willing to embrace certain standards, certain testing standards, certain standards around our marketing and advertising, certain standards around safety, certain standards around quality, certain standards. We're willing to embrace that because really fundamentally, I think hemp is the winning horse here, right? If as a
Yeah.
cannabis advocate, as somebody that consumes cannabis, right, there's this magical opportunity where even though they didn't necessarily intend it, we did get direct to your door cannabis delivery. That's awesome. I don't know why you would be in a stick in the mud when it comes to that, even if you have a vested interest in your cannabis dispensary or whatever it is. I don't know why you wouldn't just jump on board with that and really work to make that market as good as it can be. Because don't get me wrong, there are definitely issues with the hemp market and issues that need to be addressed. But I would rather we be addressing the issues in a market that gives us the opportunity to mail things to your door in 50 states than addressing the issues one by one in all these siloed state markets and hoping that at some point the federal government does anything other than pass tax cuts for rich people and legalize this plant.
Yeah, and what about high THC? What about the consumers who love the high THC that they can't really get from the hemp market? I know there's
Well,
intoxicating hemp and people are getting high off of some of the deltas, but I still think there are going to be people who want the 70 to 80 to 90% concentrates and they want more of the higher THC
Well,
components.
once again, I think that in that context, as far as the high THC consumers, I think that there are products available for them in the hemp market, at least in certain markets, not in every market, certainly not in Colorado, but at least under our sort of federal definition. In theory, you could have a product that was as high as 87.7% THC on a dry weight basis. What would that product be? It would be pure THCA, right? Because as soon as you decarboxylate that THCA, it's going to lose about 12.3% of its mass and it's going to become a THC product. So there very much are high THC products that are not the deltas, that are really based on maybe Delta 9, maybe THCA, based on various interpretations of the Farm Bill that are only available in certain markets. They're not available everywhere, but they're available in certain markets where those high concentration products are possible. Vapes are
Mm.
by and far and away one of the biggest categories for hemp operators.
Oh, yeah.
Vapes and gummies, just like here in the marijuana industry, and something sort of applies there.
Yeah, vapes and gummies are popular on no matter what side that you're on. And do you see any trends that you think operators need to watch, new cannabinoids or the interstate commerce or regulatory shifts?
Yeah, the top trend is definitely going to be that game of state whack a mole, and it happens constantly. And it happens via all sorts of means. It can happen via legislative means, it can happen via executive order. You really have to have your radar on to be picking up all of the different potential changes. If that game of whack a mole plays out, that's fundamentally what drives the new cannabinoids, right? So the deltas were fundamentally a response to not totally understanding the opportunity in THCA. It was how do we create a product that's basically THC because people want that,
Mm.
but in line with the compliance regime we're currently under, right? And so as we see states crack down, we will see probably some expansion on that front, just again, depending on the nature of the crackdown. Some states do it very broadly. They say any synthetic cannabinoid, and here's this broad definition. That's
Yeah.
banned. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get around that, but somebody's going to try. And so that's the trend to be on the lookout for is who tries, who succeeds as we see the tighten.
That's really good. I kind of want to talk about any myths that are out there. So, myths versus facts. Examples like hemp is unregulated, or cannabis brands can automatically sell hemp nationwide. Anything around any myths that you're seeing out there? Any myth busting we want to do today?
Sure. Yeah. I'll start with those two and one more we've already talked in the
Sure.
episode. So, first and foremost is that hemp is unregulated. The best lawyer answer there is it depends. And even given it depends, right, there's still definitely some regulations you have to abide on, even if we were in a purely federal realm and we weren't worrying about all the state by state compliance and regulation that happens. So at best, it's less regulated than it should be, but it's definitely not unregulated. That's for absolute certainty. There is so much restriction just by nature of being a food or a dietary supplement in terms of what you can do from an FDA perspective that we don't even have to get into the fact that this is an intoxicating substance to be dealing with regulation. And again, like I said, that's not even at the state level. So hemp definitely not unregulated, definitely not the Wild West, although there are some states where it's more that way than others.
Sure.
Cannabis brands can definitely not automatically sell in interstate commerce. In fact, if you are a corporation that owns a cannabis license, that is the last thing that I would generally advise you do, even though I'm not your lawyer and this is
Yeah.
not legal advice, right? You really should be separating out those sort of activities, right? It's totally the reverse in that regard. Your risk is much higher because you hold a state license, because you have risk on both ends, basically. One other myth that we just addressed is that there are no high THC hemp products. There absolutely are. It's just THCA. It just needs to be decarboxylated. And if you're buying a THCA beverage, I'm pretty sure that doesn't work or there's some fraud involved. So they're the combustible sort of products that are the high THC product in the hemp world generally, but still.
Fire. We need fire, right? We need to have some type of ignition with fire.
Correct. Yeah, you need fire or you need where we can weigh it down so it's still 0.3 sort of thing. That's what we have to do. And
Uh,
again, even that's not by default lawful, right? There is no, it's weird because we talk about a national market for hemp, and there is, but there really is no national market for hemp. There are national operators selling on kind of a state by state basis into 50 different state markets. And they're trying to formulate products that will fit as many of those markets as possible. It's not necessarily a national market like they really are looking at this kind of complex matrix of state compliance and making decisions accordingly with can I comply with the regulations in Illinois? Can I comply with the regulations in Colorado? That's how I'm going to whittle down my sort of list. So I would put that as a bonus for meth. There isn't really a true national market, and certainly not anymore for these products. You really do have to be looking state by state, but at every state.
that was perfectly said. And wrapping up, yeah, if you could leave our listeners with two key takeaways, what would they be?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the very beginning of our conversation here today. The first is that the hemp cannabis divide is primarily a legal distinction. It's the same plant. They're very similar markets. I won't say they're identical. We've identified a few differences, but they're very similar markets. Responsible operators have a very similar view for the future, namely that these products aren't going to be marketed to children, that these products are going to be in packaging that prevents children from getting a hold of them, that these products are going to be tested to some quality standards, where the exact line that we're going to draw for what's safe remains to be determined, but that they're going to be tested to some quality standards. they share a similar view for the future. And I think we all can agree that we dream of a day when we can sell cannabis in 50 states and have it mailed straight to your door. That sounds amazing. And
Yep.
I think we all agree on that. The divide is a legal one. The divide is maybe somewhat of a cultural one, as folks have picked a side and stuck to their guns. But we're more alike than we're disalike. But because of that legal distinction, this is takeaway number two. There are still, in many ways, fundamentally different markets, these two markets. They operate differently, especially when you think about putting together a compliance framework. That's probably the biggest way they're different, although there's lots and lots of other differences. There's opportunity from a diversification perspective when you go into hemp or when you go into cannabis, but that opportunity carries inherent compliance risk. Every new market you're exploring is going to have a new compliance regime that you need to deal with. And if you want a one size fits all compliance solution, that's going to severely limit the markets you can operate in because not every state's the same. Most of them are very.
Those are some good takeaways that you left everybody with. That's very helpful. Thank you so much for being a guest. I think I'm really surprised at how much we're able to pack into under an hour. So I appreciate you coming on and just sharing all the information and how knowledgeable you are. I would like to let our listeners know if you're looking to stream this podcast, it is available on Spotify, Apple, and wherever you like to listen to your episodes. And you can also check out my YouTube channel, which is at Under the Microscope with Jenny, and go ahead and subscribe to the channel and check it out. And thanks again, Aaron. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I had a great time. Thanks for the opportunity.
Sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. We are coming in and doing a little added section here. We wanted to make an update regarding changes that recently happened in the hemp industry. We had recorded this podcast last week, and then there were some changes in the hemp industry, and Aaron is going to be providing some additional context for our listeners just to make sure that we're tying everything in appropriately with this podcast episode that we did. I'll let you go ahead and take it over from here, Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big surprise since we last recorded this episode was I had previously said that I expected the main thing to happen would be this sort of state by state whack-a-mole as more and more states would restrict the hemp market. But generally, there didn't seem to be a lot of federal will to make any kind of hemp restrictions happen on the federal level. There were certainly attempts, but there just wasn't necessarily the political will to get it through on its own. With the most recent budget fight, folks that have been trying to shut down the hemp industry had a unique opportunity. And at the 11th hour, at the last minute, we saw a federal ban on intoxicating hemp products come into play. And it's a very broad ban. It's much broader than the ban that, for example, Colorado has that I referenced before. And that presents a real challenge because now no longer will we be looking at this sort of situation where states are restricting it. We'd be looking at a federal level prohibition, which runs the risk of turning the hemp market into effectively cannabis 2.0. The states license and regulate it. It would function as a federally illegal industry, but state laws would apply and operators would try to comply with those. That's obviously a very bad situation because, as I said, the hemp industry is one of our best vehicles, in my view, for getting 50 state access to cannabis, like I think all of the advocates and business people's vision is for this industry. And that is currently set to go away 1 year from the date of the budget passage, which I think is today. That's a real serious problem, but it also presents opportunity because we do have that 1 year grace period. So there's considerable opportunity for lobbying Congress, and that's happening as we speak right now. There are organizations working on pushing this issue. Right now, consumers are waking up and realizing what was contained in the budget, and they're voicing their displeasure all over social media, and hopefully they're calling their Congress people, who knows, though. And another key feature of this budget is, as I understand it, this budget is not going to get us all the way to that 365 days. In fact, there's going to be another budget negotiation that will be happening in late January. So there are many opportunities to work on reversing this course, modifying this course in some way, finding some common ground because I see obviously folks on the hemp side are devastated, but there are a lot of folks on the state licensed marijuana side. They're really excited about this news. And again, I think that the federal government trying to restrict this product in any way is really fundamentally not what we as an industry should be cheering for. I think there's an
Mhm.
opportunity for us to come together, find some common ground, and try to address this. Again, we've talked about issues in this episode with intoxication. We've talked about issues with testing, quality, safety, things like that. All of those things are things that I think that we need to address, but an outright ban is simply not the path forward. And I'm certainly not alone in this. I believe Governor Phil Weiser even actually sent a letter out just following the passage of this sort of ban in the budget saying, you misconstrued my previous letter asking for more clarity on hemp under the federal definitions. We're not looking for a ban, we're looking for a regulated market. And I think that's the situation we're in. And that's the situation we need to be pushing towards.
Thanks, I appreciate you. Just wanted to make sure we added this little piece to the end of our episode because all the Under the Microscope episodes are always done a week ahead of time before they go live. So we just wanted to make sure everything aligned. The industry is always changing and you just never know when something's going to happen. So it is important to always add these updates. We appreciate the listeners understanding why we added this in at the very end. And I appreciate you, Aaron, for coming on and always sharing your knowledge